to us. I want to thank Kevin Platt, who's the faculty director of the Graduate Humanities Forum and is also the director of our program on Peripheries this year. And I want to thank Zain Lakhani, who is the Graduate Research Fellow of the Penn Humanities Forum this year. The two of them, along with their League of Graduate Humanities Fellows, have worked very hard to put this together. I want to congratulate them on bringing such a superb group of four humanists in the broad sense that we like to conceive of the humanities here at the Forum, ranging from art and design through the kind of core of literary and cultural study to the human sciences and their overlaps with the humanities. So it's, I'm not going to introduce our speakers. I'll leave that to Zain, but I just want to congratulate the organizers on bringing such excellent scholars to Penn. I'll mention a couple of quick things. We have a hashtag if anyone is tweeting. GHF Symposium will be the hashtag for this event all day. And finally, I want to thank Sarah Varney and Jennifer Conway, who are our intrepid full-time managers of the Humanities Forum. I'm just a very occasional part-time worker at the Forum. So thanks to Jennifer and to Sarah, back of the room. Zain, turn things over to you.
Thank you, Jim. And I'm going to echo a few of those thanks before we get going here. And I'm going to start out by saying thank you to Jim for all that he does for us at the Forum. He's our director, and it is his tireless work that really makes the Forum what it is today. So thank you very much for everything that he does for us in the Forum in general and for bringing this symposium about. As he mentioned, my name is Zain Lakhani. I'm one of the graduate fellows here at the Penn Humanities Forum and part of the Graduate Humanities Forum, which is the smaller division that's brought this symposium together. And so in a minute, I'm going to introduce our speakers, but I also want to, before that, thank you, echo Jim's thanks to Kevin Platt as well, who is, among his numerous other responsibilities at the Forum, the director of our little group. And it is really an honor for all of us to work with him, and he's extremely helpful for all of us in thinking through peripheries and our own research. But in addition to thanking them for all of the work that they do for the Forum, I also want to thank them for, as Jim said, coming up with the innovative idea for this symposium. The Graduate Humanities Forum does host a symposium every year, but this is the first time that it's really been organized in this particular way and around such a distinguished group of speakers. So we are very, very grateful to their innovative vision for allowing us the opportunity to gather everybody here today. And secondly, I want to extend my sincerest gratitude to Sarah Varney and Jennifer Conway, who are officially, as Jim said, the administrative coordinator and associate director of the Forum. But having worked closely with them over the past several months, I have come to think of them more as a pair of magicians who organize and maintain every aspect of the Forum through an amazing combination of hard work, talent, and experience. I can honestly say that all of today's events would take place almost entirely because of their efforts, and so I hope you'll all join me in thanking them for everything they do to support the Forum and its participants. And finally, I would like to thank our speakers for traveling to Philadelphia to be with us today, and for lending their incredible intellect to our ongoing interrogation of peripheries. As I will discuss more in a few minutes, each of these individuals has done incredible work within their field and for the greater world of research in the humanities, as it is broadly conceived. And so it is a real privilege for us to be able to work through these questions with them, and one that we are all very grateful for. This symposium is designed to interrogate the meaning of what we will call peripheries, a series of relationships, concepts, and constructs that exist across almost all aspects of social, political, cultural, and economic life. As we have discovered over the past year, these concepts of center and periphery are often deeply embedded in humanistic research, whether explicitly or implicitly. But what they mean, what work they do, what they enable, what they foreclose, is far from clear. In this roundtable, we have asked our speakers to reflect on the meaning of peripheries, both within their research and in their academic practice, to try to get at some of these fundamental questions of power, privilege, and access. Specifically, can we study centers and peripheries without reproducing the structures of power our research is designed to reveal? How can we analyze the very real effects of center-periphery hierarchies on the lives of groups and individuals, while simultaneously challenging the constructed nature of these relationships? How does the paradigm of center and periphery relate to other potential organizing metaphors for research and experience? And finally, how can we teach about centers and peripheries while navigating these various methodological challenges? Each of our panelists has been invited here today not only because they push the boundaries of academic excellence within their fields, but also because in vastly different ways their work critically engages with these fundamental questions. Jane Geyer is a professor of anthropology at Johns Hopkins University, whose research focuses on economic transformations in West Africa, particularly the productive economy, the division of labor, and the management of money. She is the author of numerous books, including Marginal Gains, Monetary Transactions in Atlantic Africa, and Money Struggles in City Life, which was the result of a collaborative effort with a Nigeria-based network of social scientists on the currency devaluation in the popular economy under the structural adjustment of military rule. Eric Hayot is a professor of comparative literature and Asian studies at Penn State University, whose work interrogates the way in which China, both as a geographic entity and a cultural and political singularity, has affected the intellectual and cultural history of the West. His books include The Hypothetical Mandarin, Sympathy, Modernity, and Chinese Pain, and most recently On Literary Worlds, which, if I'm not mistaken, was published by Oxford University Press just this past year. And so congratulations to Professor Hayot. René Marquez is an associate professor of visual art at the University of Delaware, and who we're happy to say graduated from our very own University of Pennsylvania with a master's in fine art. His research includes post-colonial studies and critical animal studies, and he has held numerous exhibitions at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, the Philadelphia Art Alliance, the International Center of Photography, and the Ayala Museum in Manila, among many distinguished others. And finally, Kazys Varnelis, who is the director of the Network Architecture Lab at Columbia University, where he also teaches studios and seminars in history, theory, and research. His work, which includes such edited volumes as Networked Publics and The Infrastructural City, Networked Ecologies in Los Angeles, focuses on contemporary architecture, late modernism, the relationship between architecture and capitalism, and the impact of recent changes in telecommunications and demographics on the contemporary city. Today, we at the Penn Humanities Forum join a long list of distinguished institutions that have had the pleasure of hosting Professor Varnelis, from Harvard to Yale to the IUAV in Venice. Over the next 2 hours, we will hear from each of these speakers individually, and then after a short break, we will open it up for discussion and a question and answer period, which we hope will be a time when each of our speakers can really engage with each other about their presentations and pull at the cross threads of each other's work in conjunction with all of you. As you can see from the oppressive array of divergent research interests we have on stage today, we at the Graduate Humanities Forum aim to engage with peripheries not only within our own disciplinary-based research, but across disciplines as well. What innovative ideas might be generated by asking a scholar of contemporary West Africa to ponder questions of power, privilege, and access with an expert on network theory? Or by placing a scholar of comparative fiction alongside a visual arts scholar who engages in his work through both the writing and practice of art? It is with great pleasure that I turn the microphone over to our first speaker so that we may begin to find out.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. With 10 minutes, I've been thinking that the main contribution that one can make is to pick out just a few keywords, high points, puzzles in one's own work. As you can tell, perhaps, the very first thing that I can suggest to you as a contribution is that if you live long enough, you've lived through a lot of different theoretical frameworks and different ways of bringing our intellectual repertoire together with a changing political economy of the world. So I thought that maybe one of the things that I would start out with was just to suggest to you or remind you that somebody of my generation will have lived through articulation theory, world systems theory with center-periphery concepts, the concept of friction, interface, margin, disjuncture, and now I think that we are working, and this will be one of my contributions in my paper, a proliferation, which is the kind of thing that is graphically very well represented by your poster here, a proliferation of different kinds of interchanges, interfaces, places where, as my own work is concentrated on, commensuration is taking place, where different regimes of value, action, practice, imagination are brought together and reworked, rethought, perhaps negotiated in an economic sense, but also reimagined. And that reimagination has become constant, I think, in our current world. So we are inheritors, I think, at this particular point at the beginning of the 21st century, of this series of theoretical interventions that we can think about critically. What does each one of them offer to us working in the places that we particularly work? And as you heard from the introduction, all of my own empirical research has been done in West Africa and on economic issues where the question of margin, of interface, of places where different value regimes are brought together, even in very, very small specific places, has been really at the center of my attention. In thinking about power and the hegemonic power of theory, I keep in mind a very graphic image to myself that I realized very early in my work on money. And that was that the 17th century theoretical interventions, John Locke, for example, of liberalism. John Locke, as you probably know, worked on money, and he was one of the real promoters of a general single money for the whole of the British economy. It was to be based on metal. The metal was to be pure. There was to be pure money as there was to be pure and simple and direct language, for example, in the contractual frameworks for a liberal society and economy. And as you probably know, he brought in Isaac Newton to run the mint. There was a whole institutional endeavor to unify and to, as it were, purify a set of quite varied practices within the British Isles. At that very same moment is the expansion of the slave trade by British merchants and European merchants inventing monies to mediate the trade. And some of those monies were made in Britain. The manillas were made in Britain. The cowries were imported from the Indian Ocean, but passed through Britain on their way to West Africa. So these were invented monies at the same time as we're inventing the unicity, as my French colleagues in this world talk about it, the unicity of British money and then of economic theory based on a singular money, right? When I very first started to work on money, just to keep the graphic imagery in mind, I went to the museum collection, here we are in a museum, at the Museum of Mankind in London, to look at the Manila collection. And there's this huge, in those days, dot matrix printout. And all of these monies that were invented come under the designation of primitive money. Primitive money, made in Birmingham, imported by British fleet from the Indian Ocean. So, I mean, this is perhaps the most graphic example that I can give of the implicit, explicit, hegemonic practices with respect to some of the classifications that come forward to us from intellectual history. But I think that this one is so relatively simple to see that we can't just rest satisfied with that as a single example. We have to bring forward the same kind of critical attention to what now we are thinking is general theory. I mean, we do, as professors, teach something that we purport to present to the students as general theory or social theory. But what is it? Does it have in its interstices some of these kinds of assumptions? Does it continually pass through Paris, for example? Or does it ever pass through Beijing or Lagos? And to do what? With what kinds of conceptual schemes, forms of argumentation, logics of practice, and epistemologies of empirical research? So I think that we can do the same deconstructive process, and we really do need to do that continual deconstructive process that just came to me like a lightning bolt standing in the Museum of Mankind. So that becomes, however, even more difficult in a world that has proliferating centers and peripheries. Where is one placing oneself? So another key word that I would just put in place and is in my own subtitle to this presentation is the linguistic concept of deictics. I'm thinking also in a humanities vein, right? All utterances are necessarily positional in some sort of way. They're positioned in time and space. And different languages do this very differently. And our imagination from comparative linguistics might help us to deconstruct the particular deictics of our particular moments and our particular problematics as we carry out empirical research and then fold it into conceptual frameworks and forms of argumentation. So I found that a very helpful notion to bring forward, because deictics can be so mundane. They're not necessarily the name on the theory. I mean, here is a deictic. Here it contextualizes the speech, right? Here is only understandable because it comes from me here, now. So that kind of deconstruction of our own work, I think, it is very important. So as an extension of that idea, how do we do it? Well, like speech, we do it by interchange. We don't necessarily always know the implicit deictics in what we're saying. And I was always, just to go through a little bit the history of some of these terms, I was always a little skeptical of reflexivity. You know, I thought, how am I going to deconstruct my own, positionality relative to I mean, the British Empire was still in place when I was a child, right? And gender and generation and so on. I mean, I need somebody else to tell me, look, Jane, this is rubbish, This looks very different from somewhere else. So the structure of those conversations, it seems to me, is extraordinarily important. I mean, who do we implicitly and explicitly invite in to those conversations where there's a freedom of engagement, where somebody else's positionality deictics is something that we have to then respond to. And in that regard, and this is my final point here, I have developed in the paper an approach which I myself would like to take further. I have written one paper, but I want to take it further, which is, what are the concepts that people themselves have of this kind of proliferation that you have on the graphic here? What is the concept of confusion? Do we have theories of confusion the way we have theories of order? Do we have concepts that cover that kind of phenomenon in social life and imagination in practice? Just as a final sentence, the Yoruba have an orisha devoted to the whole domain of confusion, who, I'm learning from my Brazilian colleagues, comes forward into candomblé in Brazil, and that is often referred to in daily life. So if we're thinking about the classic old South-South as a periphery, maybe we are getting from the indigenous conversation that will engage ours some of the key concepts that we might not have in our analytical register at all. So let me leave it there.
Morning, everyone. to add my thanks to James, especially to Zane, who made everything possible from our end. So that was great. Thank you for coming. I just have 5 things to say. Well, 2 of them have subpoints. It seems to me that as we think about the sort of relationship between center and periphery and the kind of work that the concept like center-periphery does, that you immediately run into the problem of the implied hierarchy. And so, there are 2 ways to use center-periphery, and one of them is to sort of be descriptive, but what happens is you say, well, there's centers and peripheries. This is what I take world systems theory to be doing. But of course, that immediately makes people mad, because what they feel like you're saying is the peripheries don't matter, right? So the centers are where important things happen, the peripheries are exploited. And on the one hand, you can say that and say, look, I'm showing how exploitation is happening from the center, and so I'm sympathetic to the peripheries, and I want to indicate the degree to which the peripheries are being abused in one way or the other. But of course, at the same time, you leave the sort of hierarchy there that gets produced as a hierarchy of agency, right? So that you at the expense or in the way that you try to locate yourself on the side of the periphery, you actually then seem to diminish the possibility of the periphery to ever actually matter in some way. Right, so then what you do, right, so there's that move, right? The next thing someone does is say, well, actually the periphery isn't that peripheral, it's contingent, and in fact sometimes it's more central, and so on and so forth, in which case, your whole center-periphery concept ends up sort of collapsing, and you say something like, peripheries are not actually actual, but they're made. So Jane just spoke, and she mentioned Africa. I work on China. One of the things that we know about Africa and China, and this is true of a number of other places in the world, in fact, indeed of all peripheries, is that no matter how peripheral they are, one of the ways you can tell they're peripheral is that people spend a lot of words trying to convince you of their peripherality. That is, the 19th century is full of documents that assert and theorize and locate the peripherality of various parts of the world with such an aggressive intensity that you might wonder whether they were really as peripheral as all that, and if they were really that peripheral, then why would you need to talk about how peripheral they are all the time, right? And then you could also talk about the sort of centrality of the need to locate the peripherality. Deconstruction. So that one of the other ways to respond then is, so once you've deconstructed the kind of the balance and deconstructed, I don't mean just at a conceptual level, but actually at a historical level in which you're looking at how the sort of concept of periphery are managed, is to say something like the periphery is the excluded that must be included, right? This is a kind of, again, a classic deconstructive response to a structure like center-periphery, which is to say that we want to theorize a system, and in order to theorize the system, what you have to recognize is the system produces a hierarchy, and one of the names of the hierarchy that it produces is center-periphery. And so, and the ways that system gets theorized from the center very frequently is about theorizing the limits of the center, and by naming the things that are outside those limits, the peripheral. But as we know from sort of the deconstruction of gender and so on and so forth, it's precisely the excluded object that returns via its exclusion to sort of locate and ground the nature of the center and so on. Okay. So, what are the alternatives then to, so part of what I've been trying to cover is the ways in which center-periphery as a structure moves through what seem to me to be fairly predictable conceptual stages in which one engages with it, in which it sort of has a set of social functions, in which those social functions are critiqued, in which the conceptual structure is undermined. And at some point what happens, and this is certainly true in the field of geography where I've been doing a lot of reading, some people want to say, well, look, the whole center-periphery thing should just be thrown out the window. It doesn't sustain itself. So then, we get these other options, and Jane was listing some of those. I want to list a couple others. And these are all options you have to recognize that are more or less spatial metaphors for describing the interaction between spaces or nodes of unequal power. Right? That's essentially what we're trying to figure out how to do, is how to describe inequality and how to do it using spatial metaphors. So flow, right, is a common alternative to center-periphery. That is, you say, well, there's no such thing because things flow from here to there, and so there's no real center and there's no real periphery. There are spaces that are temporarily peripheral, but in fact, even those are products of flow. Right? Network, another common option. Flat ontology, where the spatial metaphor is in the word flat, right? So everything is sort of ontologically even. Hybridity, I think, is an older model, right? And not a spatial model, but a biological model. One of the things I would say is that the biological models dominate the 90s and the spatial models dominate the 2000s, right, as we're thinking about center-periphery. all these alternatives, flow, flat ontology, hybridity, and so on, also have problems of their own, right? That is to say, that they can be engaged both historically and conceptually and philosophically in exactly the ways that the center-periphery structure is engaged. And so it's not really, I mean, that's one of the things, one of the ways you might approach the humanities is to say, oh, well, our job is to find the best concepts, and then we're testing all the concepts, and then we when the concept fails, we come up with a better concept, and one day we'll have the right concept, and then we can all go home and rest. But clearly, it doesn't work that way, partly because we don't want to put ourselves out of jobs. Other people are, I suppose, doing that for us. But this means two things, which is, one, that we tend to act as though the fact that a concept has problems is a problem. But in fact, it's not a problem. It's just the way things always are. So having problems isn't a problem. Right? That is, if a concept has some kind of conceptual problem, that's okay. And that what we might do then, instead of saying, oh, this concept has a problem and therefore it's no good, we should find another concept, if we recognize that concept too will surely have problems, is to recognize that what concepts are mechanisms for managing and generating certain kinds of problems. Right? That rather than thinking about the problem that a concept generates as an accidental feature of the concept, we might think of the problems the concept generates as a functional feature of the concept. Right? At which point the concept ceases to be about what it is sort of considered in a kind of relatively restricted framework, which is to say the concept itself, and then becomes it is seen to be about the problems that it generates and manages. Right? So then you could rewrite the entire history of concepts. I'm suggesting someone ought to do this. I'm not going to do it for you. And in fact, I'm probably not capable of doing it. But you could rewrite the history of competing concepts as a history of problems that feel like they need to be made problematic, or problems that feel like they need to be made present and made visible, right? So for instance, center-periphery is about agency, right? That is what grounds the problem of center-periphery is to think about how power flows in unequal spaces, right? And so we think, well, okay, well, let's look at the whole history of all of these concepts as attempts to manage some other problem that seems to be kind of at some level underneath those problems. And look at the ways in which the management of that sort of substructural question, right, which is how does power work, what does power flow, how does power function in social spheres and historical spheres, how is that then altered, how is the theory of power altered by these successive concepts, right? At which point, again, we move from a kind of, I think, slightly hysterical model of sort of concepts meeting in battle and succeeding each other to a kind of more less antagonistic, I guess, and seems to me more subtle model in which we watch and we observe the ways in which certain kinds of substructural problems throw off and generate concepts that themselves are designed to highlight or negate certain features of that substructural problem. Okay. Last thing. One of the ways to think, so I guess what I've said so far is that I'm encouraging you to think about center-periphery as a concept that does, like any concept, two major kinds of things. The first, which I've covered, is to highlight certain kinds of problems that it asserts implicitly are important problems, right, and to manage those problems. The second one, and this involves a slight shift in emphasis, is to think of center-periphery as not a sort of problem-developing concept, but rather as an epistemological concept or a heuristic concept that's designed to produce certain kinds of objects. That is, if we think of center-periphery as a lens, we might ask ourselves what becomes visible within the visual frequencies that are made available through that lens, right? Or we can think about it as a radio or an electron microscope that allows us to focus at a certain level of the social object, which is deep and complex and can be focused on from any number of levels, right? So the question to ask, which is the question we always ask with method, right, is not just well, I think what we think about method is that method's describing something out there. But when we say something, and I'll say more about this later, but obviously every method also produces its objects. So the question would be then for me to ask, what kinds of objects is center-periphery designed to produce? And what is the value? And the point is not like that's bad because it produces, assuming every concept produces its objects, it just seems like this is the kind of question we should ask about every concept. And then the second thing is, once it's produced those objects, what is the value of producing those objects? That is, why would you want to produce objects like that? What do you get? What do you see when you produce objects in that way that you don't see when you produce objects in some other way? Right? And then finally, to turn this back around to where I just came from, the question would be, how does the value of those objects highlight other kinds of what I'm calling problems, concerns, questions, that is naturalize and make visible certain kinds of structures or anxieties that themselves are, if not exactly the real subject of the concept, then certainly part of what the concept is put into place to manage and think through. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Morning. I'd like to add my thanks also to Zane, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me today. Just listening to the first two panelists, I feel like my initial response to this topic is actually to consider my own position sort of in this panel, and then more broadly, the position of art in the academy. And that's sort of where I want to go with this. I think as an artist, and I don't know if there are other art people in here. So for one thing, as an artist, my research, if you want to call it that, is very much introspective, right? And then I ask myself, what is art as a discipline? What is the methodology of art, and what is the role of art in the academy? I think that is a question that institutions sort of haven't asked, right? I think we just accept that a liberal arts institution, a humanities institution, or an institution that values humanities has to have art, that art is somehow important. But the question is, what does art do for us as a discipline, right? And the reason I come to that question is essentially a feeling, and I'm going to use the word "feel" a lot because that's one thing that I feel is important to art, right? That's one thing that art offers is a kind of intuition, is a first-person experience, is a feeling that is different, and I think, and I say different from sort of more traditional disciplines. And I think that's why art's position in the academy is somewhat complicated and problematized. Because I think that we have hierarchies of knowledge, right? And that those hierarchies of knowledge are essentially a modernist base that privileges empirical research, right? Which is not to say that art doesn't have its own sort of empirical value. But the question is it research, right? And I think that that's a very interesting question in art these days. We have a lot of programs academically that talk about art research. Like, what is art research? Like, what does it mean to research art? I mean, what is the critical dialogue in art in and of itself? Okay? And I think that it's a hierarchy of knowledge is what art contributes to the conversation. However, I think that that's also it also positions art sort of on the periphery. Okay, that's and that's what I'm interested sort of in thinking about. The other thing that I'd like to bring up is that as artists, we are practitioners. And that there's a kind of knowledge that comes from the practice of making art that also contributes to the conversation. And in fact, I'll talk about this afternoon, but in a way I feel like the real authority that I bring to this conversation is as an animal caregiver. One of the things that Zane didn't mention in my introduction is that I run a sanctuary for dogs. And in fact, I would say that is currently my primary studio practice, is that sanctuary. And anyway, I'm going to talk about that this afternoon. My point being is that that's not interesting in an academic setting, right? I mean, that's not something that one comes in and says, my authority is in running an animal sanctuary. right? But that animal sanctuary and what I do with it is an extension of the studio practice that sort of came before. And what I do with that sanctuary, there's a kind of ideology and philosophy behind it, which is about, post-colonialism, but again, I'll talk about that this afternoon. Anyway, just a quick quote. Vicky Hearn, who's an animal trainer, poet, philosopher, talks about working with animals as providing a knowledge which is unmediated and therefore not so nervous. So what I'm really interested in the idea of center and periphery is the knowledge that we sort of can't pinpoint, the knowledge that is somehow not so concrete, right? It's not empirical, it's not provable, so what is it worth, right? And those are the questions that I'm interested in asking. To turn that a little bit in a different direction, I also think that as an artist, I can't think of the term center and periphery and not think back to the 1980s, the kind of culture wars, panopticon type 1980s discussions of, mainstream, margin, other, and so forth. If you recall, 1993, or actually I guess it started in 1990, right? The NEA 4, we have 4 artists who were awarded grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, and then those grants were sort of surreptitiously taken away because the work of these artists was deemed obscene, right? I always forget all their names. Karen Finley is maybe the most popular name. Anyway, I'm sorry about that. But what's interesting to me is that in the years following, and I should add, the 1993 Whitney Biennial, right, for those of you who are familiar with the Whitney. So this is an exhibition that is supposed to be representative of what is happening in art. This is the state of contemporary art in the United States. And in 1993, we have what was labeled the political Whitney. We have work from a lot of artists of color, women, gay artists, and the show was essentially panned, right? People said it's all politics, there's no art here, what is going on? That combined with sort of the NEA 4 situation, following it, we get a real chilling effect. Although I don't think we talk about it so much as a chilling effect anymore. What is really interesting to me is now we have people saying, the identity stuff is not really that prevalent anymore. Like, artists aren't thinking about that anymore. And I think artists are thinking about it. I think we've been told not to think about it. That there is an aspect to sort of the art world context that no longer wants to hear about it, right? And so we have artists talking about, making work in different ways. So getting back to the idea of center and periphery, thinking about that 1993 Whitney and what happened in art immediately sort of brought me to this, and I came across it recently, which I thought I should share. The well-known Audre Lorde quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's home, or the master's house, right? And to me, that's essentially this discussion of center and periphery in the academy is the master's tools, right? And so when I talk about different kinds of knowledges, as an artist, I'm interested in offering or at least exploring other tools. Why would you want to dismantle the master's house? Maybe you don't, right? But again, that's an issue of where do you stand, center or periphery? And I think as an artist in academia, as a person of color, as an immigrant, I feel positioned in the periphery, right? So my experience is that. And while I may not want necessarily to dismantle the master's house, I would like my own house that is equal in some way, so that I don't feel marginalized, right? I'm also thinking about this, the Audre Lorde quote in relation to this idea of, how we teach, and can we, is actually one of the questions I ask my graduate students is teaching a conservative practice, right? I mean, are we in our teaching not just perpetuating these structures and the knowledge that have come before us? I mean, how do we teach in such a way to enable subversion, right? It seems very contradictory, but to me, I think that's how art functions. And I've always felt like the role of art in an academic institution is to sort of always question the practices of the institution, which is very hard these days. But how do you teach that, right? One of the things that I always ask of my graduate students is, how does what you're doing in the studio help you think about whatever it is you're thinking about, right? That's what I'm talking about in terms of being a practitioner, right? To me, I mean, if you want to call that research, you can call that research. I would probably be less inclined to call it scholarship. Let's just call it ideas. We'll just call it, practice. I'm not sure that academia or that the university is the best environment for that. And I do actually have an example this afternoon where that's happening. And actually, beyond that example, you just look at art and you kind of look at different cooperative efforts that are being made, sort of both physically, virtually, all collaboratively, but in response to the failure of institutions to sort of embrace what artists are interested in doing. Just as a kind of real world example, I would never be doing what I'm doing without tenure, right? I am not going to get tenured for my work with dogs. People might find it really interesting, but it's peripheral, right? It would be regarded as peripheral to the practice of an institution. So what I end up doing is trying to discuss that work in terms that is more palatable to an academic setting, right? But always being mindful that that's what I'm doing and how that has to happen. So the last thing I wrote here was the personal is political. So just to go back to that, I think that to me is one of the really interesting aspects of center and periphery. Is a sort of, aside from theoretical frameworks, it's like, well, how do I feel about that, right? Where am I in this? How do I position myself, and what do I do about it? Okay, thanks.
All right, so a position statement, as all three of the great preceding position statements should situate both the speaker and the topic. And in this case, your speaker is an architectural historian thrust into being an interrogator of networks and network culture. I guess I'm just going to move. I only have, and I can't resist being someone who teaches in architecture using images because I like them, and I'll show some art too, just so you know you aren't alone. I'll show two images, one of which is art, and one of which is the product of a different form of research. For my position statement, because although I could talk about being both an American citizen and a Lithuanian citizen, about teaching at Columbia, although in a curious situation of being in both a professional school where also I am not in a tenured situation. I'm in a other situation that is also not an adjunct situation. I'm actually an officer of research. And I also teach in Ireland, and in fact will be there on Tuesday, where I teach it. I was a founding member of the faculty at the University of Limerick, so a School of Architecture. So things get confusing, I think, in many ways for me. But at the, which is, I think, a not too unfamiliar a subject position today. But at the same time, what I want to talk about is this topic of research that I've been taking on. And situate it a little bit for you, and that is the issue of networks and their relationship to centers and peripheries. And I want to start with an image, again, because we like art. This is an image that no matter how good the projector would be, you'd still not be able to see it. It was probably in real life about that size. This is an image called George W. Bush, Harkin Energy and Jackson Stevens, circa 1979 to 1990, and it's a pencil drawing made in 1999 by Mark Lombardi, who is an artist of networks, and perhaps the best artist of networks we still have to this date, even though it's 13 years after his suicide. By chance, the drawing I chose is one that Hélène Badiou pointed to in 2003 during a lecture at the Drawing Center, in which he described it as a new vision, and while introducing his 15 theses on contemporary art. And he literally pointed to it. You can see it on the internet, which is the only place you can find these 15 theses easily, is on the Lacanian Inc. site. He's actually pointing to the image right there. And in particular, this drawing depicts an insider trading and accounting scandal that took place between 1979 and 1990 involving the company Harkin Energy, then run by George W. Bush. And it involved some insider trading, money laundering, and so forth. But it turns out the future president would be cleared by the SEC, perhaps not surprisingly, for being unaware of what was going on in his company at the time. Likely. Lombardi himself wrote that these drawings were narrative structures, each telling a story that would expose what he called structure, mechanism, uses, and abuses of power in the global political economy. Let me get close up for a second. Curator Robert Hobbs, who put together the definitive show of Lombardi's work at the Drawing Center that in 2003, that same show, suggests that this work evokes Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, which is our departure point in this day of talking about centers and peripheries. Hobbs points out that Lombardi's drawings explore a liquid global economy, the role of digital technology and telecommunications in money laundering, and remind us that there is both agency involved in world systems and also in centers and peripheries, and there's also deceit and secrets involved. Badiou elaborates for us, and by no means, please, I'm not at all a Badiou scholar. I know very little about him, to be honest, just cards on the table. But I found what he had to say about Lombardi very interesting. Badiou elaborates that this work depicts that which, as far as empire is concerned, doesn't exist. Through its abstraction, art renders this inexistence visible. This is what governs the formal principle of every art. The effort to render visible to everyone that for which empire, and so by extension for everyone, though for a different point of view, doesn't exist. In other words, what Badiou is saying is that this drawing shows us the system is not merely a network, but rather it is a network of individuals and institutions with particular motivations. Because, of course, it is drawn as a network, not as a question of centers and peripheries. It is, in fact, a network within the center. And you notice Osama bin Laden's name is there, and also George W. Bush Jr. is there. And there's kind of, the story goes that after 9/11, this drawing was up at the Whitney, and either FBI and CIA just descended on it to try and understand it, because they couldn't understand it any other way. So, empire is not just a fact, and neither is it form. Empire is not just a fact, and neither is its form, the network. Rather, it is something that is specifically constructed and put into play by the extremely powerful. And this is what this reminds us. Beneath it is not merely a cold logic of capital and automatic system. That's a story we can tell to make everything seem surgically clean. There's also, again, cunning and deceit. Or is there? Because as we look at this drawing, for all of Lombardi's intentions, we realize that the lines of connection do not indicate anything in particular. We can't actually gain any empirical knowledge from them except a connection. And what does that mean? there's no key to this. We're left with a web of interwoven relationships. Some nodes are more connected, yes, but they are all reduced to a similar graphic level. The nature of the players, the forms of transactions between them obscured. Let's say, give you another analogy for this sort of thing. Let's say you found an address book. If the owner didn't describe their name in it, and in fact, obviously put their name in such a place that you could tell it was them, could you deduce whose it was? Can you deduce what this is really about? And I would argue, in a sense, you can't. Although we observed George W. Bush, Harkin Energy, and Jackson Stevens circa 1979 to 90 with a confidence that we were seeing secrets exposed, as the FBI and CIA might have, just as soon as we seemed ready to identify them, those secrets slipped away. And yet here I think something else is being made visible, whether it is Lombardi's intentions or not. And that's that conspiracy, as Frederick Jameson reminds us, is an unconscious way to, quote, think a system so vast it cannot be comprehended by the natural and historically developed categories of perception with which human beings orient themselves. And if, following Jameson, since postmodern times it's been impossible to think one's way out of the system, then we find ourselves caught up in this world, in this Lombardian network diagram. As I gaze at this, I often wonder, where am I in it? Where's my own role? Where is your role? The true horror of these drawings, then, is not the scandal they show, but rather our own inability to find ourselves outside of them, something that has been, let's say, added to by the mythology the reality of Lombardi's death and this conspiracy theories that have grown up about it. Where does the center and periphery lie in this condition? How do we avoid being suckers caught up in these conspiracies? And worse yet, are we in a Philip Dick novel, players in the conspiracy all along, making this happen? This is what I would like to argue is the nature of network culture today. And there's another diagram of networks that Lombardi's work recalls. And I find that this diagram, that's become rather famous these days, produced by Paul Barron in his 1964 report for the Rand Corporation on Distributed Communications, is also very compelling and has a bit to do with the previous one and two questions of centers and peripheries. In this set of diagrams, we see three modes of communication: centralized, decentralized, and distributed. In the first one, the centralized, it's rather obvious, right? We see a world clearly made up of centers and peripheries, a hub and many nodes. The second replicates it in greater detail, a kind of fractal view of the first. And the third proposes a different condition in which all nodes are equal. All are as connected as they may be. And this, of course, is such a seductive diagram because everyone is equal, and we like that. Graphically, it suggests a world beyond hierarchy, beyond center and periphery, a different way of exposing things. But again, as Eric pointed out, a different way of exposing problems, a different way of problematizing the matter at hand. Alex Galloway suggests this is nothing less than a Deleuzian rhizome. Perhaps it then could be a diagram of the multitude. In fact, Hart and Negri say the distributed network structure provides the model for an absolutely democratic organization that corresponds to the dominant forms of economic and social production. And it is also the most powerful weapon against the ruling power structure. And this, of course, leads us back to Audre Lorde. Now, Barron created the seminal analysis of networks with a specific design goal in mind, and this is where I want to finish up with. And that is that military command and control of the armed forces in a post-nuclear situation. That was what undistributed communications was about. It was not about trying to invent the internet, and in fact, the internet's invention had very little to do with this book, or the report, although retrospectively it has been depicted in such a way. So this is a project to maintain redundancy and the ability to route around extreme damage after Soviet first strikes. And to do that, one needed resiliency. So always seeking the most control for the least expenditure, power ripples through networks. Whether it be the study of networks or the study of core and periphery models, or any of the other frameworks that I think all of us have lived through. You've lived through perhaps a few more, but I can't believe how many. It's getting there. The 80s culture wars, Cornell. I noticed when you see, yeah, I was there. So whether it be the study of the network of networks, the study of core and periphery models, what new models will emerge? This power ripples through us too, as we inevitably play the role of handing off messages in the chain of transmission, messages that command us to maintain and extend the network. And to conclude, what I for my position statement, what I want to suggest is two things. One, that we constantly try and find out what it is those messages are, those messages we may not even know we're carrying, as we are inevitably finding ourselves caught up in the system. That's one thing I think that we can do, and we have to do. And the other, to become methodologically aware of these matters. And the other thing is to try and understand the implications of network topologies and the other topologies we're creating. The topologies that are being, in fact, imposed on us in many ways. The project of mapping and historicizing power, I would argue, remains as important under network culture as it was under postmodernism 30 years ago. Right, thank you.
So,
hello, video recording. I'm part of I'm in the ideology now. I'm Simran Thadani. I'm one of the grad fellows. I've had Peripheries much on my mind. This was really engaging. I'm thinking about the questions that all of you raised about what centers and peripheries are and what they seem to be, and then how we represent them. For instance, your mention, Jane, of language and the imprecision of language, and I've been thinking a little bit about, word lists and dictionaries and synonyms, and are all words just trying to reach a concept that they cannot possibly reach? But then also conceptually, the last presentation, which sort of showed these maps, and I was thinking, as soon as I saw something, I had a response to it that was like, oh, this is a flight path map, or this is, because you have these sort of conceptual recognitions of certain things that you see, or that the London Underground map, has, it's a way of representing something, but it's not that thing. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments or thoughts, any of you, on sort of, especially in the context of flow and continuum and the sort of changing nature of the core and periphery relationships that we're analyzing. How can you sort of document, in a sense, what doesn't exist? And since there are many ways of documenting any given thing, how do we kind of deal with that issue? Here's a question you cannot answer, but thanks.
I too have to use. Oh, is it not on? It should be. It's on? Okay. I mean, one of the things I think about with center and periphery, right, is if you think about this, the impact of a combination of sort of Marxist, sort of third worldist in the old sense, and post-colonial critique on the humanities in the last 3 decades, that one of the most fundamental questions is to ask what the epistemological impact is of the tendency to think from of academic work to think from the centers in which it's located, and therefore what the and I use this word in quotes because I'm going to critique it in a moment, whether there's a contribution to knowledge that can be made, or a contribution to human history that was made historically by the places that the 19th century and early 20th century European thought had excluded from the sort of major stories. I take center periphery to be one of many concepts that's asking us to, that's trying to answer that really fundamental question, which is, at some point in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Max Weber says the question before us, the research question before us, is how it came to be in human history that Europe was the place in which universal concepts were invented. Right? I think that much of what has happened since the 70s is an attempt to sort of unthink the premises of that question. And to do so for both political reasons, which is to say to sort of produce agency and open up the possibility of revolution if you're a Marxist and so on and so forth, but also make people aware of their oppression, right? I mean, so that, and so on and so forth, right? So to engage and encourage revolution. So you can imagine someone saying, well, look, yes, the periphery didn't do anything, but damn it, if we get our act together, we can have a revolution, and then we'll own half the stuff. We'll own our half of the stuff, right? Or you can imagine someone saying, well, in fact, this story that's been told about the periphery is nonsense, and that if you rewrite or if you look at history from way X or way Y, I mean, you get this in a small version, which you say, well, where would Picasso be without African masks? Where would the empire be without India? and so on and so forth. I mean, these kind of, where would Europe have been without the silver that it mined with slave labor out of the Americas? And so in that sense, you acknowledge the sort of power of the center, but you also acknowledge the creative and impact and effect of the periphery in one of two modes, and these are interesting modes. One of which is the mode of the slave or the abused, right? Which is a mode of participating in history, but not a really awesome one, because you participate only insofar as you're exploited. Or another mode, which would be the mode of the equal participant and the producer, right? And so with African masks, you get something like that. And there are other versions of that. That seems to me the fundamental problem, and I think that the risk with center-periphery is always that we simply binarize or hierarchize it rather than recognizing that it's part of this long-standing set of approaches. And so the reason that there's such a premium on working in peripheries for all of us in the humanities, always now, that is to say that everyone in the humanities, every graduate student, every faculty member has to locate their work in some periphery, whether that's an epistemological periphery or a geographic periphery or power periphery, a gendered periphery. That is, all correspond to this great task that we have set before ourselves, which, is, as I say, it has these very interesting intersections between the political and the epistemological or the true, right? That is to say, there are good reasons to say some things are true sometimes even though they're not true. And then there are good reasons to say things are true when we're trying to actually figure out what is true. And so I think that's my sense of how I, at least initially, want to respond to some of the things you've said.
Maybe I can just add one brief thing, and also in appreciation of having an artistic set of colleagues. And your question, in a way, is artistic. What is the perception of a representation that makes a particular presentation of the world familiar, plausible, persuasive, even perhaps without an argument behind it, just as instantly recognizable? And one of the things that I want to put before you, because it's a puzzle to me, an ethnographic puzzle, is that the concept of the system seems to me to be a rising presence in our culture. The students talk about, well, that's part of the system, right? I think one of us used the concept of the system in that sort of a way, a vernacular way, right? Meaning exactly what? But giving a certain kind of systematicity to some parts of this that we were showing here, without necessarily explaining to anybody what we actually would mean by that. And when we delve into what those institutions and practices are actually doing, we find all kinds of inconsistencies and impasses and so on. So I think that, in a way, you're asking almost like an ethnographic question of how the intuitive mention of the system in our current culture is working.
There are a bunch of things I could say, but the one thing I'm just going to that I'll maybe focus on is, I think that this question of what René raised earlier of what asking students in studio, what is it that you really want to talk about, and how is that informing how is what you're doing informing it, and vice versa, of course. This is something that, of course, is, I think, crucial to scholars in the humanities as well. And I think there's a long history of investigation of something that may actually be about of scholars who've investigated something, whatever it may be, let's say 17th century French thought, when they're really interested in something going on right now, maybe even in their personal lives. Or I think of one scholar I know who's interested in neuropsychology and the art, and it actually in large part has to do with issues in their family. There's somebody they know, and it becomes interesting when the project is then. I think many projects we take on, many of our epistemological, what appears to just be a matter of a kind of epistemological problem we're having, really may have to do with something else, and it's that something else that I think this remove that you're talking about, in a sense. Like, how is it that you were thinking of flight maps, but also how is the map of the London Underground really talking about something else entirely? Now, another thing that I think is happening in the contemporary generation, and I'm maybe not part of that generation anymore, but I partake in it, but I also know students and other faculty members in the humanities are doing it. And I find very interesting is people who do other things that are not things outside of their what they're supposed to be doing. Whether it's running a dog sanctuary, or I have a friend, Lytle Shaw, who's a professor at NYU. Actually, he and I both went to Cornell at the same time, when we were just towards the end when you were there. And Lytle is very well known as a scholar of poetry and so forth. But he also runs this strange project called the Chadwicks that involves looking at the transactions between the Dutch and New Amsterdam, and kind of a confusion of temporalities, and it's an art practice, if you will. And he's not trained formally as an artist, and yet there's something about that work that is extraordinarily compelling. And if one will ever try to understand him as a scholar, one will have to understand why he's compelled to make a model of a 18th century pub in Manhattan when he's a tenured professor and works with the history of poetry. So what I think I'd like to say is that there's also this desire for even this need for not just theories of confusion, but a need for confusion, a need for approaching some of the projects that we're talking about today, approaching centers and peripheries in sneaky ways that might not be obvious, ways that might be a little bit off center. And in fact, one of the things I think that Zane didn't mention, or maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention to, as is my wont, when she was mentioning my background, is that I also am in a practice called AUDC, and we've tried to approach some of these things both theoretically and also with a set of let's say architectural models and drawings that deliberately slip away from scholarship. I mean, everything else is very scholarly, but then the drawings and the models are meant to convey other stories and to convey, in a sense, the impossibility of scholarly knowledge being complete or total. The fact that scholarly knowledge itself produces problems, as Eric was saying. So I don't know if that helps or just creates a confused theory as opposed to a theory of confusion.
My thought is, am I able to see myself? I mean, that's what I think. When you talk about language that way, is language constructed in such a way that I have control over it to tell my story, right? I think that's what artists do, right? Is tell their stories, and so I get really interested in, the idea of subjectivity and. Am I in a context that acknowledges my subjectivity in a way that I can tell my story? That sort of freedom can allow for the creation of an image that doesn't currently exist. I think what is very interesting about that is being able to sort of, deconstruct the images that we've sort of been taught, right? And then coming up with something that is sort of more representative of kind of the self. But I think that's the hard part. And again, that's why I think teaching becomes so difficult, as a kind of subversive activity. How do you teach someone to create their own language, to tell their story when there are all these other stories sort of telling us who we are?
No one else will raise their hand. So, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Anyone else want to?
Any other questions?
Okay, Mike, I have two questions. I think they're connected, but I'm not quite sure how, and I'll try and be quick because I hate long questions. So the first question is sort of prompted by this sense that we're interrogating the center-periphery concepts as analytical concepts. Professor Geyer began with this suggestion that we have these paradigms that have been changing. Center-periphery was one of them, but now we've moved on to something else. Maybe we can get other concepts from other places. And I just wanted to ask about the reality. It's sort of a devil's advocate kind of a question, but the reality of centers and peripheries in the way that our human world is constructed. And I guess I'm a good enough postmodernist, or post-postmodernist now, right, to know that, reality just means a discourse, but it's still out there, right? It's not something that we necessarily control, right? The human world is put together by centers and peripheries that other people identify, whether or not we identify them. And those centers and peripheries hold sway in the way that money flows, people flow, institutional power is conceived, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess this is the question about, how do we deal with that reality, whether or not we, deconstruct these centers and peripheries, call them contingent, move on to another paradigm, et cetera. They're still out there in the way that other people conceive of the human universe. What do we do about that? Is there a reality effect that we have to be answerable to? That's question one. Question two, which I think is connected, but I'm not sure, is really a practical question. One of my other roles here is to be caretaker for a graduate program in comparative literature, which has a theory list that the students have to work through in their first year and then get examined on. And there are perennial questions about what's in the theory list and what's not on the theory list. And we're in the process of another revision of the theory list. And one of the questions which always almost predictably comes up is, well, look at this theory list. It's all these, European continental philosophy type. Mostly, it's like straightforward, start with the Greeks, I guess, and go through, there's a little Dante in there, but then we mostly get, bogged down in French and German philosophy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what do we do about this? Should we just dump it and do we need non-Western, other aesthetic and philosophical traditions that we're going to modularize and stick in this and I'll try and master? Is there a possibility, and this is, I guess, a question which is really prompted initially by Professor Geyer's presentation, is there a possibility to actually get away from the sort of situated, general theory to some kind of truly general theory? Is there a world, academic language out there to be had? Or is that just another version of hubris? We would just produce a different list which presents our situatedness in a different way at some meta level. And in fact, we should be provincializing our own list and realizing the specificity and I think digging down into the locatedness of our institutions and our practices in our art, realizing the art of the theory list as opposed to trying to make it a scholarly function. So that's the practical question. So the two questions.
Maybe since you've mentioned me, I'll start in there. First of all, the reality of centers and peripheries. I pick up very enthusiastically on Eric's point about identifying agency. And I think that one of the lens implications of centers and peripheries tended to be that there's a systemic logic that does things. Right? And of course, as you probably know, that one of the responses from anthropology was that no, there's agency in the periphery, and our account of agency was not necessarily the logic of those systems, but the reaction of those peoples to the presence of the system. And I do think that question of agency needs to be looked at very, very carefully. And coming back to the question of language, I feel quite frustrated that quite a bit of our argumentation is done in the passive voice. I mean, literally the sentences have some abstract something appeared from or if I can think of an exact example, but it's very, very often the world was complexified or the systemic logic produced X. Whereas, I think that our work as scholars is to dig down, as you say, and think, well, how? How exactly? If a center is a center of a set of ripple effects, that's an empirical proposition, or it's a proposition for empirical research, that there was this effect or this sort of knockoff domino, whatever, of exclusion or inclusion or domination, then our responsibility as scholars is to figure out how that happened, not to put the whole process in the passive voice and accept that. So I think that your reality point is a very important one that needs to be added to the center periphery framing. This is a process of constant reproduction. It's one of the things that I've felt more and more is that there are certain kinds of interfaces, center and periphery, if we want to call them that, interfaces that are reproduced over centuries in different ways. So the question then is, well, what's the agency that's doing that, and how are they doing it, right? And then the theory list, yes. I think that the just awareness of other formulations of the phenomena that we're looking at is very important to bring into our teaching. That I mean, we don't have to be representative. I mean, we can't be. How can we possibly be representative? I mean, all those languages, all those literary traditions, all those probably extraordinarily brilliant works that are in languages that we don't have any scholarship about in the West at all. I think that we have to convey that we are exemplifying the process of a different way of attacking or conceptualizing or thinking about or being agential in a situation, rather than, of course, creating another module. So that depends then on the teacher and the students. I mean, which would be very useful locations to pick for that particular process. I mean, I don't pretend, for example, when I teach about Africa, I don't pretend to know North Africa. I don't speak Arabic. I don't know those traditions, right? But I tell the students that. It's not that I've excluded North Africa from Africa. It's just that this is not a terrain that I know. We're going to use particular examples because those are the ones I could work with, right?
So, I think I take your question about the reality of center-periphery to be to have kind of two dimensions. You said it somewhat. You talk about reality and you talk about reality effect. It's like racism. So people say, well, race isn't real, but obviously people believe in race and it has powerful effects, and so we should study racism. And it seems to me that's what I would call like the easier version of the challenge you're posing, right? The more difficult challenge would be like actually center-peripheries are real, which we're not going to say about race, right? And that is they are. Or we might. I mean, that is to say that we're talking about sort of real structures that can be identified and defined. I'm perfectly happy to say that. I mean, that is, whether people in the center know they're doing this or not, that we can use language of center periphery to describe real relationships, that is, actually existing relationships in the world. That doesn't mean they're always going to be the same, or that they're going to be the same in the same fields. I mean, I think center periphery relationships are really different when it comes to military affairs than they are when it comes to music, say, right? And that seems to me that those would all go into the pile of trying to think about some overarching center periphery theory. But otherwise, it seems to me quite possible and easy and important. In fact, one of the things that the categories like center and periphery are for is precisely to name social realities that in a way that makes certain kinds of action visible. Right, that's the point of them, and so I'm all in favor of that. I mean, I don't think that saying a concept is invented then means that the thing that the concept describes is also invented, right? So for instance, I don't think that Plato knew he was breathing oxygen, but I think that sort of oxygen is a scientific category that I could use to describe what Plato was doing, even though he didn't know he was doing it. If that makes sense, right?
I think exists whether or not we think it exists. Whereas centers and peripheries are supported by discourse. So the concept is imbricated in the process of reproduction of the reality.
Sure. So then change the concept to culture, or sort of, Plato doesn't think about his anthropological situation the way that we think about anthropological situations, but I don't think that means that we can't use our anthropological sort of terminology to sort of analyze. I mean, that seems useful to me and good, and it seems to me that what we do whenever we're generating knowledge is to generate knowledge both to describe, but also, to sort of make visible certain aspects of reality that weren't describable beforehand. The theory list, just quickly, I think you have three choices. This is a classic complete problem. One is to say, look, theory is just this local thing, and it's the name of this thing that happened in Europe, and and so it's this kind of historical thing, and we're going to look back and say, look, there was this era where Europeans believed in something called theory, and they did it, and they created meta discourse and discourse about it, and that's what, and we're going to learn that because that group of texts has a very particular name. It had a self-privileging, series of self-privileging effects, and it has a very particular and special relationship to the discipline of comparative literature, and so we think of it as central. The other one, which would be the inclusive one, is like, oh no, we only said Europe has theory, but everybody has theory, so let's go find some Chinese theory or some African theory, and then we can show that everyone has theory. And of course, that's like, on the one hand, that's inclusive and nice. On the other hand, you violate the integrity of the concept, and it's the kind of generosity of saying, you too get to be just like us, right? Which is not always the most generous thing in the world, right? Well, the third option, and so I like the first option, which is the modest option, or I like the third option, which and I don't like the second option much. The third option is to say, look, there's something that you might call like theory, of which theory is an example, which is to say a kind of thought which doesn't have a name, but a kind of thought that attempts to think, aesthetics and politics and some other stuff and philosophy all together at once. And one of the sort of historically most profound examples of theory that we're interested in is what was called theory. But there are also other historical examples of theory, in medieval China, for instance, that constitutes a kind of field of thought and engagement that we have to recognize is radically different from theory, but also a type of theory, right? And therefore, what you're doing is comparative theory, comparative theory, right? Which is to say, how does our relation to what we call theory, which is, say, 19th, 20th century German and French business, change when we look at other sort of models for the kind of intellectual ferment, flexibility, self-referentiality, dealing with a certain set of questions that have happened historically elsewhere and elsewhen, right? And therefore, how does that historicize and in some sense, make smaller and less kind of universalist the theory that we know, while pushing us, because we're in comp lit, always to be mindful of the ways in which shifting your geographic and temporal frames allows you to get some comparative leverage on the objects that you're trying to think about.
Okay, maybe we're just going to do the order we're doing before. It's getting predictable. Reality effect. Who is it? There was someone back in the 80s, I think it was at Cornell, but I could be wrong, maybe it was like Habermas or somebody like that, who at some lecture said, just for the sake of argument, let's pretend there's a reality. And then you really had that raised, all sorts of trouble back then. And yes, there's reality and there's discourse. But the reality, there are two ways of thinking of that reality. One is the kind of, I would say even, one is the political reality of flesh and Benjamin's famous statement that there's no artifact of culture that is not also an artifact of barbarism. And how do we do that? And some days I do wonder, how do we continue to function? How do we continue to function in that situation, or even or doing whatever it is we do? And it can be debilitating, and yet it seems important to be doing what I'm doing, and so I continue on. And then there's another, and maybe that's cynical, maybe that's a cynicism deeply embedded into academia that we can't get over. And then there's also another kind of reality, let's say, that's just as real, and that's a physical reality, which I also teach in, which is the reality of buildings and urbanism. And there's no real way, except, of course, back in the kind of certain kind of epistemological arguments one could make, to really deny that there's, like, New York City is there, and kind of there are physical buildings around it. And I do teach a class every spring called Network City, and in that class, it's a class that actually just focuses on the American city. I'm increasingly focusing it in on New York and the Boswash megalopolis, and yet, and looking at it as the product of many things. One of which is to sort of lure students in of telecommunicational networks, but also networks of capital, networks of population flows, and then once they're lured in, they wind up having to learn other things. And there are two things that arise from that course that I want to show. One is that the reality, as I teach that course, and it has to do with urban planning and architecture and the relationship of the two. One is that inevitably, in order to explain this material, I also have to deal with deep questions of subjectivity and talk about crucial readings on sociology that are of the time that we're looking at. So even if it may be even if it may be from Europe, looking at Zimmel, talking about the subjectivity of the individual about 100 years ago in a city, in the metropolis, whether it's Robert Park and Ernst Burgess looking at mobility, and that is a kind of if you will, in easier to understand, maybe in Deleuzian terms, the deterritorialization and reterritorialization of the individual. They didn't know Deleuze wasn't around then, but that's essentially what they're talking about in terms of mobility in the city and as individuals move in there. And so there's a kind of, in that course, what I realize is that in order to talk about reality, I have to talk about discourse, and I have to talk about the way that subjects are constituted, and also about how these theories emerged and what kind of feedback effects they had. Because in certain ways, Park and Burgess's theories, for various reasons that would take too long to say, sort of said maybe segregation ain't so bad, because people are going to be apart from each other, and that in a way is good. It leads to competing biotic spheres. But then also, it also has a reality that has a present day, which is in New York, in Columbia. It's very easy to believe in the virtues of the city, because cities seem so virtuous these days, and yet it turns out that there's a very real political struggle now, which isn't really seen in the city, which is that many suburbs the suburb is becoming, if you will, it's been called the new American ghetto. The suburb is easy to say it's bad because it's a bad reality, it's a bad physical form, and yet it is a place in which the poor are moving to because they can't afford to live in the city. A place in which recent immigrants are moving to. Recent immigrants don't move to Manhattan anymore. They move to unless they're immigrating, unless they're, of course, one third of real estate, if not one half of real estate below 40th Street is bought by people from overseas who don't live there because they're so wealthy and using it as a hedge. So issues of global finance become a part of it. So I'm saying that there's just, if you will, there's no way for me to pull these things apart when I teach them. And that the reality, discourse, subjectivity, our theoretical constraints, these are things that have always gone together and will continue to. Now, the other thing I just wanted to point to is this question of the theory list. I had the responsibility when I was teaching at a school called SCIARC in Los Angeles in the 90s of coming up with a theory list, a reading list, or revamping it because it had been seen as being a little old. And I put the book Learning from Las Vegas by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, both, and of course, locals, yes. In fact, I met them here, and just not too far from here, a block away. And I gave that. I made sure all students would have to read that book and just a few other books, but it fit very well with both an understanding of architecture theory and also getting them into a kind of Las Vegas, but it's really about LA, so an LA mindset. And one student came up to me later on, and he was Israeli, and he said, I was in the military, before I came here, and I knew that. And he was kind of a sergeant kind of guy. Now runs the architecture program at Tel Aviv. And he said, I was reading your book, and I was in a guard tower in the Golan Heights. And he's reading Learning Las Vegas, and you realize, that's both the reality effect and also what it means to read that theory in a very peripheral situation. It turns out he is Yuval is extremely politically progressive, and yet, he had this duty. He had to serve in the army, and there he is reading from. And you realize, what that means, what it means to do that. Or conversely, another student Selva, who came from Istanbul to study at SCIARC. And I didn't know Selva. I noticed she always wore the headdress, and she was covered completely. And I thought, interesting, why. And I didn't know until I visited Istanbul for the first time this fall and realized Selva has done very, very well. And I knew she was very smart, and that she wasn't allowed to go to the university there. So I thought, well, here's somebody who is conservative, but in fact she comes from a family with religious beliefs. She wound up not being able to go to school in Istanbul because it would not have been allowed for her to go in with a headscarf. So she comes to SCIARC and winds up, reading theory, working for the OMA, and becoming and I think she would have anyway had she stayed in Turkey, but becoming a very progressive force in Turkish architecture. And so these realities in our own teaching with these students, and who later on go on to do other things, these things are all tied together. And I feel like reality is there, but at the same time, discourse is a form of reality, and theory is a form of reality. And I don't have, in my field, I don't have enough, and my own knowledge isn't enough to be able to teach a kind of comprehensive global history or kind of global theory. But one danger that I could see to that, at least if I taught it, would be that the danger of material that is non-Western being subjected to a theoretical framework that is Western, and thus, and this is different from theory, but let's say it's still similar in that sense, that the danger then is that those works they don't fit as well, and there's a kind of ill fit, and you don't cover them in the kind of depth that you can, because they haven't been developed with that hand in hand with that theory. I think, for example, of a student who I taught a history of theory class last year, and I began with Vitruvius and the ancient Romans and the Renaissance reception of the treatise, and we talked about rhetoric in great detail. My minor was in rhetoric, and so I couldn't resist. And yet she wanted to write a paper on exploring a Japanese theory of architecture using Greco-Roman rhetorical theory. And I thought, well, I mean, I didn't see where it fit. Maybe if she could prove that this person went to a school where this was popular, and possibly it's true, it might have made sense. But I felt that there was, a kind of incredible disjuncture between that. And that I think is a certain, although it can in some cases be productive, it also can do a real violence to a text, that kind of to a work, to use theories that are not imminent in any way to it. So.
I feel like you're asking if the subaltern can speak. And that's, what's interesting to me about the idea of the reality is, in a way, for those who live it, it has to be acknowledged. The idea of centers and peripheries has to be acknowledged. But then the question is, do you have access to that language that allows you to engage in that conversation, right? And I guess I'm really interested in how the political gets activated without that access, right? Like, if I can't use the language of center and periphery to talk about my condition, the idea of agency, like where does that happen for me, right? And I don't have an answer for that. I mean, I think, I guess my short answer is yes, there's a reality. It's a political reality, and it requires or it demands a kind of action. But I guess it comes back to the idea of language and how we want to frame that. With the idea of the theory list, I'm fortunately not in the position of having to do that. I do teach an undergraduate course where we don't have a kind of idea in the department of what needs to be covered. So I teach what I want to teach, and I essentially present it to the students as these are the ideas that engage me, and what do you do with them, or what can you do with them? At the graduate level, I think we sort of take a really practical position, which is what are people talking about right now, and what do you need to know to sort of be able to talk the talk, and then hopefully that allows you to do your thing also. So, for what that's worth.
I'll just add one comment to this one. Oh, yes, okay. Well, just with the architecture comparison, I mean, could you be thinking comparatively about, for example, the mechanics of stress as distinct from the aesthetics? I mean, Japan is on all kinds of earthquake faults and so on and so forth. I mean,
I thought you meant human stress.
Well, maybe. I mean, that depends what the language is, what their language is of structure, of structures in the most physical sense. Because I think sometimes some of these kinds of questions of where you're speaking from are very material. What is the body? How is it fed? How is it planted in the ground?
Oh, absolutely. And, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think you can do that. And at the same time, sometimes, we are, we're not only in the world of late capitalism. I think we're at an era where globalization maybe has reached a point of a certain kind of saturation. And to say that, to somehow say that contemporary production isn't completely informed, in other places is not informed by the same by a set of tools that we may have access to, or that exist, that may be equally sophisticated as ours. I think, for example, of a friend of mine who gave a man from Kenya came to his office. He's the head of the school in architecture. My friend in architecture in Ireland, and he also has a large office. And a man who was in Ireland from Kenya came to see him and said, I know I would like to get a job with you doing AutoCAD. And he looked at his portfolio and he realized that this man had taught himself how to do AutoCAD, and he had drawn the huts in his village, which are completely irregular forms. And AutoCAD is a program that architects do not use typically to draw irregular forms. They typically use more sophisticated modeling programs to use that. AutoCAD, however, is a program you use if you need to measure drawings. It's very linear. But he drew his village, and he said, you look at that and you realize this man is, you have to give him a job. And so you think, just he won over everybody else because he could do something impossible, and yet, and the point being that there's the kind of the material, and then the kind of the place is crucial, and then today it confronts these other worlds, like how are. For example, my student Emmanuel, I was telling you about, who's working in Addis Ababa on the Mercado, and he's Ethiopian. People use these technologies that we have, and these ideas we give people differently in different places, and there's certainly an agency there, and the subaltern uses that in different ways that the center cannot anticipate.
Thanks. My question is very similar to his, but I want to draw your attention to the very problems or challenges to the periphery themselves. Just two things. I think the bad thing might be, we say, the periphery might be unaware of the very status of the periphery. So in that case, they might remain the very status of the periphery in a comparatively long period of time to come. I'm thinking of those who shall say the colonized. Because they might believe their life can be a kind of a way they have born to be. So, and also the other thing is that there might exist a kind of, we say, hierarchy of the periphery themselves. So the periphery of the periphery. So, if we are going to think of these two problems or the challenges, we believe these two things or 2 points might possibly stop or prevent them from going, to the central, from the marginalized to the centralized. So I was wondering whether you guys could comment or talk more about, the problems or the very challenges to the periphery existing within their own spectrum, and also because. Generally speaking, we might agree that even, nowadays the humanities in general are in a periphery status compared with, the engineering and science, and everybody knows that. But fortunately, we are quite aware of the very status of the periphery, so we can hope for the best. So the bad thing is that, for the periphery, somehow, some people, or some of them might be absolutely unaware of the very status of the periphery, and even within themselves or among themselves, there exists certain kind of hierarchy. So what about the periphery of the periphery? I don't know whether you guys could follow me. So, but anyway, thank you.
I could do something brief. Unless you? Okay. I think of, we're always peripheral to someone, and we're always central to someone. And I think, for example, in Ireland, which I don't know if people hear how people would think of Ireland initially, but when I teach in Ireland, there's a very clear, and I teach not in Dublin, but in Limerick, which is peripheral. Within Ireland, it is thought of that way, no question. But Ireland is itself thought of as peripheral. I mean, there's a constant thought about it as an island nation that is on the edge of Europe. Lithuania thinks of itself as even more peripheral than Ireland because they don't speak English and because and Ireland is seen as this place where people are emigrating to. So there's an even greater sense of a periphery there. And yet, are these really the periphery? Not in, when we talk about cores and peripheries, of course we do. And when I was talking about suburbs earlier as well, suburbs have been seen as, as absolutely, this kind of, and to some degree properly, as this kind of this antithetical parasite to cities. So what is central, what is peripheral? We could go to places in Africa or Asia or South America. Are you then in the periphery, or are you actually in a? But who are you talking to, and who are you? Are you? There are people who, there's no question, there are people with vastly more amounts of power than at least any of us sitting here, and any university academic in many foreign countries, in countries that are what we consider typically peripheral, who are very central in those countries and have a great, and in that sense, there's that complicates matters as well. So who are you peripheral to? Who are you central to? And I think another thing of a disciplinary question, and the kind of the way that this can become extremely entangled. Let's talk about the humanities. Originally, if you go back to the 19th century, English had a tough time and we're in complet, but first English had a tough time getting into the as John Gilroy explains, into the university as a discipline because it was too interesting. And then more recently, comp lit was seen as kind of not quite a discipline, and this hybrid thing, so therefore not so okay. And yet, then there's art, which we know there are issues with. There's professional schools like architecture, which also there are issues with. And in art, the history of art was at Cornell. The history of art was in arts and sciences, the humanities school, but architecture history was in the architecture school, and in fact, the person who taught history of art, she did not, which I never took, but as it was reported to me, she included almost no sculptures, only painting because of the Hegelian classification of the arts, and she had no photography and no architecture. This was the 80s, of course. And yet, and so architecture is completely peripheral. It has no role in culture. No students from other fields would ever take history of architecture courses at Cornell. And yet architecture, you look at it and you're like, this is where power and money is. There's no question. It's a field of immense power and immense wealth. And so I think one of the things that we do need to keep in mind is that centers and peripheries are often in a state of flux, and as you look at it in one way, it may actually turn out to be, for someone else, it may be very different.
Eric's point about the particular theories giving you very particular frameworks and lenses is one to really think about in this regard, that the center-periphery conceptualization does focus us on the mutual constitution. But does that exhaust everything of interest? I mean, I'm very provoked over here by this concept of Ireland, coming as I do from England. I mean, this whole area was called the Celtic Fringe. Well, you can think about them as the fringe, but you might think about them as Celtic. The languages of Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Scotland are a different language, right? But do we need necessarily to just think about that as difference, right? They certainly don't. I mean, they do sometimes when they get very angry with, of course, which they do, right, with the English. But there's a particular music, particular choral, vocal tradition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, I think that one of the things we have to keep in view with a center-periphery approach is that all these other places that from one perspective are peripheral have their own originalities. And I do tend to use that word of original, an originality, when I'm teaching in anthropology, that we're not stuck in otherness, difference, in a classificatory sense. We're trying to develop the intellectual capacities to appreciate originality. And that is there in the picture, even with, an important and productive framing around center and periphery.
Can I just jump in? Since Jane said fringe, it made me think of the Fringe Festival in Philadelphia. Are you guys familiar with that? Right. I mean, so the whole purpose of the Fringe Festival is actually supposed to be sort of new and different, right? So, I mean, there's a cachet to the word fringe in this case, which is very different from peripheral. And I think I like your use of originality, because I think that's what fringe is supposed to be in this case. So I go back to the language thing, but then also I started to think about Donna Haraway. When you were talking about the peripheries of the peripheries, and I think that language needs to come up. Well, actually, Donna Haraway's language was she uses the word co-constitutive, and that the relationship is sort of the thing, right? It's no longer sort of the periphery and the periphery of the periphery, but it's the relationship of sort of the entities and what happens together that becomes important. And that's maybe where periphery can become fringe, right? That something really new and interesting can happen if we use language in a different way to indicate a kind of different type of relationship.
Just a quick thing. I mean, I think that the notion of the co-constitutive is a really good illustration of the kinds of things I've been talking about, insofar as it does a lot of valuable work. And on the other hand, you can imagine someone saying to the third world, hey, dudes, you guys are co-constitutive, so what are you complaining about? You're all in this with us, and so don't worry about your agency, because your agency is part of the great system, and therefore you should just calm down, right? So which is not to say that co-constitutivity is a bad concept, but rather that what it makes visible, right, is a certain set of structures and practices that are real, right, and useful to see, but that also then can be used in ways that are different from the ways that you want to use center-periphery. I'm not saying center-periphery is a better concept. I'm saying that each concept highlights different structures of relation. The other thing I want to say about center-periphery is it's a binary concept. I mean, it has two words in it, right? I don't want to launch into a big critique of binaries. It is not surprising that binary concepts produce binaries. That is what it's for, right? So it's not also a flaw in the concept of center-periphery. That is, you can't say like, oh, look, once again, you've got a binary, but really there's the periphery of the periphery. Yes. Every place you move the concept onto at every scale, the center will change and the periphery will change, whether that's the individual house or the city or the country, or whether it's China or Zambia or Peru or the United States or Los Angeles or New York. That in China there's a periphery. There's the Tibetan periphery, there's the Xinjiang periphery, there's a center which is both urban and located in specific cities, as you know, but it's also a racial center that's very specifically Han and that engages in processes of internal colonization. Center-periphery is a useful concept at every moment, and of course you go down into Xinjiang or Tibet. There are structures of centrality and peripherality in those spaces as well. So again, I mean, if you think that's what the concept does and is for, that's a sign of its power and its utility, as long as it's not the only concept you have in your bank, right? Because if it's the only concept you're using, then you're going to be stuck always thinking binaristically, always putting things in these relationships, and you won't remember that there are things like co-constitutivity, flow, network, and so on, which allow you to see other things, right? The point is not to get stuck with one concept, but to recognize the power of each concept that you have in your toolkit, which is why it's good to have a theory class, because you build up a toolkit of concepts and you recognize each concept then allows to polices the epistemological weaknesses of the other concepts in the field.
I mean, just you're operating with an n-dimensional condition, and we're still representing it, whether it's networks or core and peripheries, in two dimensions ultimately, and there's no way to be able to win. So I think you're absolutely right. About multiple approaches to it.
Thank you. And I absolutely hate to cut this off. I think we're going to have to break for the morning, and we will reconvene in the Neville Classroom upstairs on the second floor at 1:30. So thank you to our participants and to all of you.